Our next speaker is Kyra Stiles. Kyra has been nutrient management specialist at PEI Department of Agriculture and Land since 2013. The Master of Science in Agriculture from Dalhousie AC. Works in research, extension, and program development on nutrient management and soil quality related topics for agriculture systems on PEI. Kyra is here to provide an update on a recently completed manure analysis survey. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for kicking around. I know that it's pretty long by the end of the second day listening to presentations, but I'll try to keep it brief and to the point. And if you like hearing about manure, you're in for a treat for the next 10 minutes. So obviously we know that manure composition can be influenced by numerous factors: the commodity type, feed, bedding, whether or not you're adding anything to the manure after the fact. So for instance, in dairy production and milkhouse wastewater or foot baths. And because of this variability in commodities, types, how you're storing it, and the feed, we wanted to initiate a project to look at how this would influence nutrient content specifically and how that varies on PEI. So we've always had some theoretical values that we've used within our nutrient management course with Atlantic, the Dalhousie AC Atlantic Canada nutrient management course, but it's fairly old, so we wanted to try to update those numbers. And what we did is we put out a call to farms across PEI to sign up to allow us to take some samples from their farm through a survey. And by the end of the study, it took about 3 years, give or take, with COVID in between, that we ended up going to roughly 89 farms. And we took samples from 4 different types of commodities: beef, dairy, poultry, and swine. We tried to sample each farm at least twice, so within the fall or the spring. And overall, we had close to 170 samples analyzed. We also took a survey to ask them some questions about how their manure is stored, a little bit about their livestock numbers, and if they're adding additional products or things like milkhouse waste and things like that to their manure. We took the samples to the analytical lab here in Charlottetown and analyzed for the more comprehensive manure nutrient analysis package, and you can see some of the tests that we conducted. So what we found is that all of the samples were extremely variable, but we still ended up coming up with some averages that we'll be able to provide. And what I'd like you to take away from this schematic is that you can see that generally we have some very similar characteristics for solid beef and solid dairy. They do vary a little bit in terms of total nitrogen and ammonium content, but we also can see that even within farms, so this is total nitrogen and this is potash, you can see how large the error bars are. There's extremely a high amount of variability within farms when it comes to different manure types. When you look at ammonium in particular for the liquid manures, you can see that it's primarily most of your nitrogen, and we'll kind of talk a bit about that later, particularly with swine. And poultry is our most nutrient-dense manure that we tested. So all of this data is going to be available on a comprehensive report that we'll be sending out to producers once it's complete. It's in the final stages, but we haven't put it up yet on the website, but this will be accessible to everyone on the department website. So we took the total percentages for each of these macronutrients and put them out, to pounds of nutrient to be available based on the ton of manure or for 1,000 gallons of manure if it's a liquid. And in brackets here, you can see that for the ammonium category, you can see that I put in the amount of percentage of nitrogen that is in ammonium. And if you look down at the liquid manures, we have almost half of the manure, the nitrogen available in ammonium. For dairy and for swine liquid manure, it's the majority of it, over 90%. That has some implications later based on how you're applying it. This is showing some of the secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium. Obviously, poultry is very, very high because it's supplemented in their feed to a larger extent, but there's still some large amounts for both in commodities. The moisture content specifically can vary dependent on type of manure, and this is important because as we think of total nutrient content within manure, you're going to have a dilution effect if it's a higher amount of moisture. So for our solid manures, you can see that poultry litter had the highest dry matter content, and that the solid beef and solid dairy generally ranged between, well, the majority of it is within 20 to 30% or 15 to 30%. Typically, we would say a liquid manure has less than 5% dry matter content, and solid would be greater than 20%. But given that we sampled it based on storage type, so if it was in a field, we're considering that to be solid, or if it's stockpiled in a barn, it's solid, and if it's been stored in a pit or some type of concrete containment device, it would be liquid. This is the distribution of carbon to nitrogen specifically for solid beef manure, but you can see the ranges below for carbon and nitrogen for all the commodity types. This is important based on a higher carbon and nitrogen ratio. You're going to see probably an effect on nitrogen loss or nitrogen emissions if it's fairly high because you're getting a lot of mineralization. Usually that's around kind of above 25. But the majority of our solid beef and dairy manures kind of fluctuate within the mid-range, so around 15 to 20%, down to 10, sorry, not percent, ratio, 10 to 20. And so this can also have an effect on the ability of it to compost. You kind of keep an idea of carbon and nitrogen ratios if you're trying to actively compost and actively turn your manure piles often. So that will kind of have an influence on the nitrogen cycling effects. Now there's going to be many graphs here, and I'm going to kind of try to go through them fairly quickly because you'll have access to this later, but I'm going to point out some of the important stats that we found associated with it. You can see that poultry has the highest total nitrogen percentage, over 2% is the median, and you can see that a lot of the other solid manures varied below 1%. For ammonium, most of these are fairly low except for your poultry and your swine. Dairy can be fairly high if you're applying it at a time that it would be available. So all of these amounts are total nutrient amounts, and they're going to be affected by how you're applying it, what equipment you're using, and I'll get into that a little bit later, or right now actually. So these are some of the nutrient available projections that we would have for using liquid manures. So this scenario, I'm using the average amounts that we received in the study for nutrient content. So let's say if you're putting on a liquid dairy manure before or early June, so we're saying early spring, at a rate of 6,000 gallons per acre. We are assuming if we're using that incorporation within 1 day or within 2 days, you're going to be able to retain 60 to 70 pounds of nitrogen for that crop. If you're not going to incorporate it at all, you're going to go down to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's using a broadcast spreader. So let's say if you're using a more efficient manure application method like injection or dribble bar, you're going to see upwards of above 80 to 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre. For phosphorus and potash, it's extremely potash dense, so we're getting over 120 pounds estimated. These are all estimates. For phosphorus, around 20 pounds per acre. So I wanted to point out the amount of nitrogen that you could predict based on the incorporation method, because that's highly tied to the amount of ammonium that's in the liquid manure sample. So when you are applying manure using a broadcast spreader or a splash pan, just the process of applying it when it's kind of much higher off the ground and it's not uniformly spread, it's just kind of dispersed very haphazardly, you're losing upwards of 50% of it immediately through ammonium volatilization. And so that's why we are using these different estimates based on whether or not you're incorporating it or how you're applying it because of that volatilization loss. So with using a more efficient methodology for applying injection or dribble bar, you're actually applying the manure much lower to the soil surface. It's going to be more uniformly applied. And let's say if it's during a standing crop or something that might over time very quickly kind of grow over top of where you're applying it right on the surface, it's going to reduce the amount of sunlight coming down, hitting the manure, providing heat to kind of volatilize it, and it's also going to reduce the amount of wind that is going to, over time, add to the volatilization process as well. So that high amount of ammonium is going to be volatilized if it's not worked into the soil effectively and quickly. Using these estimates for the amount, we used a price for urea. If you're using a dribble bar or injection, you could be retaining the value of $58 to $73 per acre in fertilizer value costs using those methods. So some factors that will increase nitrogen retention from liquid manures and reduce the nitrogen loss due to volatilization are some of the methods I have previously said. So try to incorporate it into the ground immediately, as quick as possible, within 24 hours ideally, if you're using a broadcast spreader. Otherwise, use equipment that might efficiently put it right on top of the soil surface or right below with injection. You may want to apply it during the growing season as based on when you're hoping to do forage cuts and things like that, or if it's prior to a corn crop. So spreading it on during the growing season when you know that the plants are going to take it up fairly soon. And also earlier in the spring, later in the fall is more efficient in terms of reducing volatilization because you have colder temperatures, or soils are colder, the air and sunlight is a little bit not as conducive to having volatilization loss. When we look at solid manures, they are not very high in ammonium at all. You're mostly getting organic nitrogen in terms of total nitrogen within your manures. So there's less of a concern to incorporate that very quickly. In fact, you're going to have organic nitrogen that's going to break down slowly over the next few years. And we have some estimates here that if you're applying it, let's say in the first year, you may receive 10 to 20% of the total nitrogen. Second year, around 10 to 30% of that residual total nitrogen, and still a little bit more in the third year. This, of course, doesn't account for all of the other wonderful soil quality benefits that you're getting from an addition of solid manure. Also very excellent sources of potash, and you can see in the estimate below for solid manure into a standing crop around 10 ton the acre, you could be getting over 100 pounds per acre in potash as well. We also looked at the effect of storage type on nitrogen content. So the only statistically significant difference in storage content was within liquid dairy for total nitrogen and for solid dairy. So for liquid dairy, it was slightly higher in a covered storage. And when we say covered, most of these were underfloor slatted. So only one or two farms that we sampled had some type of cover over their concrete pit, but most of them were underfloor. All the other storage types for liquid dairy included concrete pits, lagoons, and underfloor slatted, and then all of the solid manures would have been samples taken from stockpiled in field or in barn bed pack. This shows the effect of storage type on dry matter. So just focus here particularly on the liquid dairy, because in this case there was a significant effect on dry matter on the covered or covered storage types. And that's to be expected if it's not going to be exposed to precipitation and extra moisture. And that had a direct effect on ammonium as well. We also looked at sample timing for nitrogen and ammonium content. So we took samples in spring and fall. As I said originally, for percentage of total nitrogen, there was no difference for any of the commodity types statistically. But for ammonium, we did see a statistical difference between liquid dairy with a higher amount of ammonium within the fall. We also looked at copper levels within liquid manure in particular, and whether or not there was an effect of the addition of foot bath liquids into the liquid manure. There was no significant effect, it was a little surprising, just given the amount of copper sulfate that could be potentially added to manure into the concrete pit. But we did see high levels on both sides, whether or not there was an addition of the foot bath or not. And I'm wondering perhaps if over time there could be some type of residual effect of using, if there's any supplementation or feed, or if it's collecting within the manure, it's being applied to the fields, taken up in the feed, and then brought back. So if there's kind of just like a cyclical effect of high copper levels. And this is just something I wanted to point out, because given some of our samples were fairly high in copper, it is something to kind of keep an eye on if you're regularly applying liquid manures to certain parcels of land, to keep an eye on the copper levels, because it can reach toxicity levels, particularly in sandy soils. I saw some references around 50 to 60 parts per million, although it is dependent on the crop that you're planting. So we saw a wide variety of different consistencies, as you probably could already see from some of the nutrient content variability. These are some of the solid manure types that we took. You can see different amounts of straw content. And because of these variations in nutrient content, the main takeaway message, it is still crucial to still manure sample on your farm for your own individual nutrient content availability. If you do not have samples currently, you can use these values that we have, and they're a good reference point, and it's also very useful to see whether or not you fall in range for a lot of these nutrient values. But in terms of making recommendations, it's still imperative that you take the samples on your farm yourself. And there are a few different strategies what you could use for sampling liquid manures and solid manures. So I'm highlighting here, you can make your own sampling device for the liquid manure. We kind of have an adjustable pipe that we made. We take samples out of the concrete pit once it's high and has been agitated for at least a day or so. And you would want to take numerous samples, up to 10 from the pit, or you could also take it directly from the spreader, using like a clean garbage bin, and just kind of take it from the relief valve. Mix it really, really well, place it in a container, and you're going to want to freeze it immediately or bring it to the lab immediately. Because it has such a high amount of ammonium, it can create off gases and it will bust your container, and it's also not going to be a representative sample if your nitrogen content is changing within the container. So bring the sample into the analytical lab or whatever lab that you currently use and get it tested. If you are taking it when you're agitating it and getting ready to spread, obviously you're not going to have your results back in time to make recommendation changes applying right then, but it's going to be something that you can use later on in the fall or the next time that you spread the manure. For solid manure, similar strategy, except just use a shovel or a pitchfork. Dig deep into the stockpile that you're using. You don't want any of the crust to be in your sample. You would like to use kind of within the pile, and take numerous samples, 8 to 10, put in a large bucket or garbage can. We use a plexiglass sheet to dump it on top of, chop it up really, really carefully so that you can kind of get a really good homogeneous sample, and then take a small subsample, put it in a bag, bring it to the lab. Recommending to repeat this test every rotation or so, every 3 or 4 years, and try to get a nutrient analysis then, unless you're making significant changes on your farm associated with feed or the way that you're storing your manure. But generally, if you have a good handle on what your values are like, because you've been doing consistent operation management practices over the last few years, you don't have to do it every year. If you go to the analytical lab, the package that you want is M10L. There's a few different packages you can get for manure analysis. The M10L has the ammonium-specific test to it. And you want to have that just to be better at analyzing your total nitrogen content for that year based on how much organic nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen is in your sample. I also want to mention that we do have a manure nutrient content calculator worksheet from the department. It's currently on the AIM Potato Board website and will be going on our website shortly. But if you're interested in having this, I can send it out to you at any point. Just give me an email. What you can do is, plug in your values that you get specifically from your report for the first 6 columns here. And then these last 2, incorporation value and nitrogen coefficient value, are going to be based on how you're applying your manure. So if you are applying it in the spring, summer, or fall, you would put in a different nitrogen coefficient value over here. And if you're going to be incorporating it dependent on immediately within 1 to 5 days of application or not incorporated at all, you're going to put in these values associated with it. And it will give you a estimated total nutrients available to crop estimate below. And one more thing I wanted to mention before I finish up is that there's a whole other component when you're looking at manure application. You have your total nutrients within your sample. Now you know how much you're going to be getting based on how you're spreading it. And now we want to make sure that you are estimating your application rate as specifically as possible so that you're getting the best benefit out of these estimates. So your application rate can be estimated very quickly through a load area method by just estimating the weight or volume of the manure in your spreader and determining the area that you spread the entire load. So just counting the amount of truckloads that went in and out of that field that you spread and estimating the volume within it. A slightly more specific way would be the weight area method, and that's something that we can help out. You can just call the department and we'll try to give us a little bit of heads up a couple days ahead so we can try to make it that way. But we can bring out scales and we would weigh the weight of your tractor and spreader full and empty, and then GPS location that you covered, and that will give us slightly more specific application rate. And we've done this on a few farms, and in most cases, what was estimated to be applied was a little bit lower than what they had thought that they were putting on, so that can skew the values that you're using to estimate your nitrogen recommendations and P and K as well. So in summary, just wanted to mention that overall, manure is extremely variable. Even though we have these averages, they're statistically many times not significant. So we have ranges, but it's very important that you still sample often, once within a rotation, or and correctly on your own farm. Liquid manures have the highest risk of nitrogen loss to volatilization when they're broadcast and not incorporated immediately. Solid manures are extremely valuable for a lot of macronutrients and micronutrients, not just nitrogen. And micronutrient levels should be monitored over time if you're regularly manuring the exact same field over and over again to make sure that they are not reaching toxicity levels. And I guess I already commented on that last one. I just wanted to acknowledge that we had many, many farms allow us to take these samples, and we probably annoyed you sometimes when you're trying to apply your liquid manure in a very short period of time and trying to make sure we got there before it was all gone. So thank you so much for signing up to do this study with us. And I also wanted to thank a lot of the Department of Agriculture land staff that helped me out with this project, Melanie Boss and my technician Danny, and some of our casuals as well who did not know that they were signing up to take a lot of manure samples, as well as Emily Murphy, who provided many of these graphics and statistical analysis within this slideshow. Great.
Any questions for Cara? I can attest that she knows her stuff. She's done the spreader and stuff at our farm, and like you said in your exemplar, it's no good to know the content if you don't know the weight that you're actually putting on, or the area you went over. Yeah. So thank you very much, Cara. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
You mentioned about foot baths in copper. Is that an issue? Because I know foot baths are commonly used in freestyle operations, and copper is used quite often for that control of foot rot and stuff like that, and heelwort, strawberry heelwort and stuff. Is it a real issue that could be a potential?
We weren't really sure. We knew that we had been seeing some really large levels on some farms, and that's why we were trying to figure out where it was coming from, and copper sulfate and foot baths kind of made the most sense. So we looked back at the survey to see if we could kind of flesh out some of the details, and we only found of those that did say whether or not it was added, we did the statistical analysis just to compare, and it wasn't significant, but I did want to flag it because we had seen some that were fairly high, and I'm not exactly sure yet where exactly it's coming from if it's not foot bath, and open to any suggestions if anybody has any recommendations on that.
Was it only on the dairy farms?
Yes. Yep.